Airline staff refuses to let black woman charge her phone. Her lawyer's response gets them all fired. Have you ever experienced a moment so unfair, so blatantly wrong, that you knew you couldn't stay silent? In today's story, one woman's quiet strength collides with prejudice at an airport lounge, setting off a chain of events no one could have anticipated. What begins as a simple request to charge her phone escalates into a dramatic confrontation that leaves an entire staff scrambling, and the outcome is nothing short of extraordinary. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy heartwarming stories of courage and justice, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support means the world and helps us reach even more people with these powerful stories. Now let's jump right in. The airport buzzed with the sounds of rolling luggage, distant announcements, and the low hum of travelers engaged in conversation. Naomi Williams strode through the terminal with an air of quiet confidence, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She adjusted the strap of her leather handbag and checked her phone for the umpteenth time. Only 5% battery left. A sigh escaped her lips. Of all days, this had to be the one when her power bank failed her. Naomi glanced around the terminal, scanning for a charging station. There it was, a sleek, modern setup tucked neatly into a corner near the gate. Her eyes brightened as she quickened her pace, relieved that she could still salvage her dying phone before the flight. As she approached, a petite woman in an airline uniform, name tag reading Linda, stood near the counter. Naomi offered her a polite smile. "Excuse me, may I charge my phone here? It's almost dead, and I'm waiting for a call about an important meeting." Linda looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as they roamed over Naomi's tailored blazer and pressed trousers. She raised an eyebrow and tilted her head as if appraising Naomi's worth. "This charging station," she said slowly, her voice tinged with an icy politeness, "is reserved for premium passengers." Naomi's smile didn't falter. She reached into her bag and pulled out her first-class ticket. "That's perfect then. I'm flying first class." Linda's expression barely shifted. She stared at the ticket, then at Naomi, her lips curving into a small, condescending smile. "I'm afraid it's still unavailable at the moment," she said, her tone curt. Naomi's brows furrowed slightly. "I see other passengers using it," she said, gesturing towards two men in suits who were casually charging their devices. "They're regulars," Linda replied, her voice dripping with thinly veiled disdain. "I'm sure you understand." A ripple of discomfort spread through Naomi, but she remained composed. "Are you saying I can't use it because I'm not a regular, or is there another reason?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. Linda's polite mask cracked for a fraction of a second, a flash of annoyance passing across her face. "Look, there are plenty of charging stations throughout the airport. Why don't you try another one?" Naomi's gaze held steady on Linda. The implication in her words was clear, but she decided to give her one last chance to backtrack. "I'd prefer to use this one since it's closest to my gate. If there's a specific policy that prevents me from doing so, I'd like to understand it." Linda opened her mouth to reply, but was interrupted by the arrival of another staff member, a tall man named Mike. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his deep voice carrying a hint of impatience. Linda gestured toward Naomi. "She's insisting on using the premium charging station," she said, her voice pitched higher, as if Naomi were making an unreasonable demand. Mike glanced at Naomi, then at her ticket, and smirked. "Premium amenities are for our top-tier passengers," he said, emphasizing the words as if to drive a point home. "We don't make exceptions." Naomi's patience began to wear thin, though her composure remained intact. "I am a top-tier passenger. If you're denying me access, I'd like to know why." Mike shrugged. "Look, lady, I don't make the rules. But if I were you, I'd just move along before this becomes a thing." A faint murmur stirred among the nearby passengers. Naomi caught a few sympathetic glances but also noticed others looking away, unwilling to get involved. For a moment, she felt the sting of humiliation rising in her chest, but she swallowed it down. Naomi had faced far more challenging battles in her life, and she wasn't about to let two small-minded individuals rattle her. "Fine," she said evenly, her voice betraying no hint of the storm brewing within her. "I'll step aside for now." As she walked away, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number. Her voice was calm but resolute as she spoke. "James, it's Naomi. I need your help." She didn't look back at Linda or Mike. She didn't need to. Naomi knew this was far from over. This wasn't just about a charging station. It was about principle, respect, and the dignity that no uniform-wearing gatekeeper could take from her. As she ended the call, a flicker of determination sparked in her eyes. The quiet storm in her heart began to stir, ready to unravel the web of prejudice she had just encountered. The minutes ticked by like molasses dripping from a jar, each second stretching into an eternity as Naomi waited near the lounge's glass partition. The faint reflection of her silhouette against the glass mirrored the quiet strength simmering inside her. Around her, life moved on, travelers pulling suitcases, flight attendants walking briskly, and the occasional murmur of passengers exchanging pleasantries. But for Naomi, time seemed suspended, a held breath before the inevitable storm. Her phone buzzed faintly in her hand, 4% now, just enough to keep her connected to the lifeline she'd just summoned. Across the terminal, Linda and Mike stood near the gate counter, their postures relaxed, laughing over something on Mike's phone. It wasn't lost on Naomi that they'd long since dismissed her presence as inconsequential. The sight of their casual demeanor added fuel to the fire in her chest, but she didn't allow it to consume her. She'd learned long ago that real power lay in precision, in striking not from anger, but from purpose. "Naomi." The voice was low and steady, a baritone filled with authority. She turned to see James Anderson walking toward her, his tailored navy suit immaculate, his silver tie catching the artificial light above them. His stride was purposeful, his expression calm but tinged with something Naomi recognized as controlled irritation. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice softer than she intended. She had called him before for other battles that required legal expertise, but there was always something reassuring about his presence. James nodded, his dark eyes scanning her face briefly before flicking toward the charging station across the lounge. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice quiet yet commanding. Naomi recounted the events, her words measured but firm. She described the initial dismissal, Linda's condescending tone, Mike's smugness, and the overt favoritism shown to other passengers who bore no more credentials than she did. As she spoke, James's expression didn't shift, but Naomi could see his jaw tighten slightly. "They think they've handled it," she finished, her tone even. "But I'm not letting this slide." James placed a hand on her shoulder, a brief, steadying gesture. "They picked the wrong person to dismiss," he said simply. He turned toward the gate counter, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tiled floor as he approached Linda and Mike. Naomi followed a few steps behind, her posture straight, her gaze unflinching. Linda noticed him first, her smile faltering when her eyes met his sharp, assessing gaze. Mike straightened slightly, his casual slouch replaced with a semblance of professionalism. "Can I help you?" Linda asked, her tone overly polite, the kind of performative sweetness reserved for passengers she deemed important. James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled out a sleek business card from his inner pocket and slid it onto the counter with deliberate precision. "James Anderson, attorney. I represent Miss Williams." His voice was as smooth as glass, but the weight it carried left no room for misunderstanding. Linda blinked, her eyes darting between the card and Naomi, who stood a step behind James, her calm demeanor unshaken. "Attorney?" Mike asked, his brows furrowing. His attempt at bravado came off forced, his tone wobbling slightly. "What's this about?" James leaned forward slightly, his presence expanding like a storm cloud looming on the horizon. "It's about Miss Williams's rights being violated. It's about the discriminatory behavior both of you exhibited toward her when she requested a service that was well within her entitlement as a first-class passenger. Linda's face paled, the smugness from earlier evaporating as if it had been struck by lightning. I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding, she stammered, her voice unsteady. There was no misunderstanding. James cut in sharply. You knew exactly what you were doing. Denying her access to a service you provided to other passengers in the same class wasn't just poor customer service, it was discrimination. Mike opened his mouth to protest, but James's sharp gaze silenced him. Before you even think about denying this, I should let you know that we have witnesses and video evidence of the entire exchange. Unless you want this to escalate further, I suggest you get your manager, now. The surrounding passengers had begun to take notice, their conversations dwindling as they tuned in to the unfolding drama. Linda hesitated, her eyes darting toward Mike, who gave a small shrug as if to say, "What else can we do?" "I'll get the manager," Linda mumbled, her voice barely audible, before scurrying off. As the seconds stretched into minutes, James leaned against the counter, his posture relaxed, but his eyes scanning the area like a hawk. Naomi stood beside him, her face a picture of calm resolve. The weight of the stares from other passengers didn't faze her. She welcomed them. If her experience could shed light on the indignities people like her endured daily, then she wouldn't shy away from it. When Linda returned, she was accompanied by a middle-aged man in a crisp blazer. His name tag read Daniel, and the frown on his face deepened as Linda whispered hurriedly in his ear. "Good afternoon," Daniel said, his voice carefully neutral as he addressed James and Naomi. "I understand there's been some sort of issue." James stepped forward, his presence once again filling the space. "It's more than an issue," he said, his tone steely. "It's a systemic problem in your staff's behavior. But let's start with today's incident." As James began recounting the events in detail, Daniel's expression grew increasingly grim. Naomi watched his discomfort with a mixture of satisfaction and detachment. This was only the beginning, and she was prepared to see it through. Daniel's face betrayed a flicker of unease as James meticulously outlined the incident, each word precise, deliberate, and razor-sharp. The surrounding passengers, drawn to the tension like moths to a flame, leaned in closer, their whispers weaving through the air. Naomi remained poised, her presence a quiet yet undeniable force. "I want to be perfectly clear," James said, his voice cutting through the hushed atmosphere. "This isn't just about poor customer service. It's about targeted discrimination. Miss Williams, a first-class passenger, was not only denied access to a service she is entitled to, but was humiliated in a public setting by your staff. And if you think this will go unnoticed, you are sorely mistaken." Daniel's lips parted as if to respond, but James raised a hand, halting him. "Before you attempt to placate us with empty apologies, let me remind you that we have both witnesses and video evidence. What I want to know is whether this behavior reflects the policies of your airline." The question hung in the air like an accusation, heavy and damning. Daniel's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His eyes darted toward Linda and Mike, who now stood stiff and silent, their earlier arrogance stripped away. "I assure you," Daniel began, his tone carefully measured, "this does not reflect the values of our airline. We pride ourselves on inclusivity and respect for all passengers. I deeply regret any misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Naomi's voice was calm but firm, her words slicing through Daniel's attempted spin. "Do you genuinely believe this was a misunderstanding, or are you simply trying to avoid accountability?" The shift in tone startled even James, who glanced at her with subtle approval. Naomi stepped forward, her gaze locked on Daniel. Her composure was a stark contrast to the barely contained panic flickering in his eyes. "When I presented my first-class ticket, Linda dismissed me. When I asked for clarification, Mike openly implied that I wasn't worthy of premium services. If this is how you treat passengers who've paid for the highest level of service, I shudder to think how you treat everyone else." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but faltered. The weight of Naomi's words hung over him, and for a moment he seemed genuinely at a loss. "This is an isolated incident," he started, but Naomi cut him off. "No, it isn't," she said, her voice rising just enough to carry across the lounge. "People like Linda and Mike don't act this way in isolation. They're empowered by a culture that tolerates, if not encourages, this behavior. I didn't come here to be condescended to, dismissed, and humiliated. I came here as a paying customer, expecting the same respect and service given to anyone else." The ripple of murmurs in the crowd grew louder, the weight of her words resonating with those who had witnessed the exchange. Some nodded in agreement, while others muttered their disapproval of the staff's behavior. The atmosphere was electric, charged with tension and the undeniable sense that something larger was at play. James stepped in, his voice smooth but firm. "Daniel, it's clear that this isn't an issue you can resolve with platitudes. Here's what's going to happen. First, we want a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, both verbally and in writing. Second, Miss Williams will be granted immediate access to the services she was denied. And finally, we'll require a meeting with your airline's senior management to discuss the steps you'll take to ensure this doesn't happen again." Daniel's face flushed, his attempt at maintaining a professional demeanor cracking under the pressure. "I, of course, will address these concerns. Let me speak with my team and see—" "You'll speak with your team after you address Miss Williams," James interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "Right now you owe her an apology." Daniel's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining from him as the reality of the situation set in. He turned to Naomi, his expression a mixture of contrition and discomfort. "Miss Williams," he began, his voice stiff. "On behalf of the airline, I deeply apologize for the way you were treated. This was unacceptable, and I assure you it will be addressed." Naomi held his gaze, unflinching. "I hope you mean that," she said, "because this isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been made to feel less than because someone decided they didn't belong." Daniel nodded, his face pale. "We'll make this right." "I'll hold you to that," Naomi said, her voice steady. James stepped back, his work for the moment complete, as Naomi reclaimed her rightful place near the charging station. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, the tide of public opinion firmly on her side. But Naomi wasn't satisfied with small victories. She knew the true battle lay ahead, in ensuring that this incident would spark real change, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or belittled. The storm wasn't over. It was only beginning. Daniel's face betrayed a flicker of unease as James meticulously outlined the incident, each word precise, deliberate, and razor-sharp. The surrounding passengers, drawn to the tension like moths to a flame, leaned in closer, their whispers weaving through the air. Naomi remained poised, her presence a quiet yet undeniable force. "I want to be perfectly clear," James said, his voice cutting through the hushed atmosphere. "This isn't just about poor customer service. It's about targeted discrimination. Miss Williams, a first-class passenger, was not only denied access to a service she is entitled to, but was humiliated in a public setting by your staff. And if you think this will go unnoticed, you are sorely mistaken." Daniel's lips parted as if to respond, but James raised a hand, halting him. "Before you attempt to placate us with empty apologies, let me remind you that we have both witnesses and video evidence. What I want to know is whether this behavior reflects the policies of your airline." The question hung in the air like an accusation, heavy and damning. Daniel's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His eyes darted toward Linda and Mike, who now stood stiff and silent, their earlier arrogance stripped away. "I assure you," Daniel began, his tone carefully measured, "this does not reflect the values of our airline. We pride ourselves on inclusivity and respect for all passengers. I deeply regret any misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Naomi's voice was calm but firm, her words slicing through Daniel's attempted spin. "Do you genuinely believe this was a misunderstanding, or are you simply trying to avoid accountability?" The shift in tone startled even James, who glanced at her with subtle approval. Naomi stepped forward, her gaze locked on Daniel. Her composure was a stark contrast to the barely contained panic flickering in his eyes. When I presented my first-class ticket, Linda dismissed me. When I asked for clarification, Mike openly implied that I wasn't worthy of premium services. If this is how you treat passengers who've paid for the highest level of service, I shudder to think how you treat everyone else. Daniel opened his mouth to respond but faltered. The weight of Naomi's words hung over him, and for a moment he seemed genuinely at a loss. "This is an isolated incident," he started, but Naomi cut him off. "No, it isn't," she said, her voice rising just enough to carry across the lounge. "People like Linda and Mike don't act this way in isolation. They're empowered by a culture that tolerates, if not encourages, this behavior. I didn't come here to be condescended to, dismissed, and humiliated. I came here as a paying customer, expecting the same respect and service given to anyone else." The ripple of murmurs in the crowd grew louder, the weight of her words resonating with those who had witnessed the exchange. Some nodded in agreement, while others muttered their disapproval of the staff's behavior. The atmosphere was electric, charged with tension and the undeniable sense that something larger was at play. James stepped in, his voice smooth but firm. "Daniel, it's clear that this isn't an issue you can resolve with platitudes. Here's what's going to happen. First, we want a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, both verbally and in writing. Second, Miss Williams will be granted immediate access to the services she was denied. And finally, we'll require a meeting with your airline's senior management to discuss the steps you'll take to ensure this doesn't happen again." Daniel's face flushed, his attempt at maintaining a professional demeanor cracking under the pressure. Of course, we'll address these concerns. Let me speak with my team and see." "You'll speak with your team after you address Miss Williams," James interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "Right now, you owe her an apology." Daniel's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining from him as the reality of the situation set in. He turned to Naomi, his expression a mixture of contrition and discomfort. "Miss Williams," he began, his voice stiff, "on behalf of the airline, I deeply apologize for the way you were treated. This was unacceptable, and I assure you it will be addressed." Naomi held his gaze, unflinching. "I hope you mean that," she said, "because this isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been made to feel less than because someone decided they didn't belong." Daniel nodded, his face pale. "We'll make this right." "I'll hold you to that," Naomi said, her voice steady. James stepped back, his work for the moment complete, as Naomi reclaimed her rightful place near the charging station. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, the tide of public opinion firmly on her side. But Naomi wasn't satisfied with small victories. She knew the true battle lay ahead, in ensuring that this incident would spark real change, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or belittled. The storm wasn't over. It was only beginning. Naomi settled into a seat near the charging station, her phone now plugged into the outlet she had fought to access. The irony of finally achieving such a simple act wasn't lost on her, but there was no satisfaction in this small victory. Not yet. Her lawyer, James, stood nearby, arms crossed as he observed the ripple effects of their confrontation. He was calm but vigilant, like a chess player studying the board for his next move. Passengers who had watched the scene unfold whispered among themselves. A few glanced at Naomi, their eyes holding a mixture of sympathy and admiration, while others avoided her gaze altogether, uncomfortable with the tension that still lingered in the air. Across the lounge, Daniel huddled with Linda and Mike, his expression grim as he spoke in low tones. Linda's face was pale, her usual smugness replaced by a mixture of fear and anger. Mike, for his part, seemed less concerned, his arms folded as he occasionally glanced in Naomi's direction with thinly veiled resentment. "They think this will blow over," James muttered, his voice low but steady as he addressed Naomi. "It won't. Naomi nodded, her expression unreadable. They'll try to sweep it under the rug, say it was a misunderstanding and move on. But that's not happening this time. James studied her for a moment, his respect for her resolve deepening. You're right. This isn't just about what happened to you. It's about the bigger picture, and they need to understand that. Naomi's phone buzzed faintly in her hand, a notification lighting up the screen. It was a message from one of her colleagues, a brief reminder about the importance of the meeting she was traveling to attend. She allowed herself a small smile. Even in the midst of this battle, her professional world continued to turn, and she wouldn't let this incident derail her. The sound of hurried footsteps drew their attention. Daniel approached with a forced smile plastered across his face, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Behind him, Linda and Mike lingered at a distance, their postures stiff and defensive. Miss Williams, Daniel began, his tone overly polished. I've spoken with my team, and I want to personally assure you that we are taking this matter very seriously. I've also contacted our regional director, who will be arriving shortly to address your concerns directly. Naomi raised an eyebrow. You didn't think this warranted their involvement before? Daniel hesitated, clearly caught off guard by her pointed question. I wanted to ensure we had all the facts before escalating the situation, he said, his words stumbling slightly. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. The facts had been clear from the start. What wasn't clear was whether you were willing to act on them. James stepped in, his presence commanding as he addressed Daniel. We'll wait for your regional director. But let me be clear, if this is just another attempt to placate Miss Williams without real accountability, it won't work. The video evidence alone would make for a compelling case, not to mention the witnesses. Daniel's face flushed, and he nodded quickly. Of course, we're fully committed to resolving this. Naomi leaned back slightly, her expression calm but her mind racing. She knew that Daniel's eagerness to resolve the issue wasn't born out of genuine remorse. It was damage control, plain and simple. But she also knew that damage control could be leveraged to her advantage. As they waited, the tension in the lounge grew heavier. Naomi could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, their curiosity mingling with the lingering discomfort of witnessing conflict. She glanced at her phone, now at 12%, and allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. This wasn't the first time she had faced discrimination. Growing up as a black girl in a predominantly white neighborhood, she had learned early on how to navigate the unspoken rules of a world that often saw her as an outsider. She had learned to choose her battles carefully, to measure her responses, to fight back with grace and precision. But even with all her experience, moments like this still stung. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a tall woman in a navy blue blazer, her presence immediately commanding attention. The regional director, Naomi guessed. Her sharp gaze swept over the lounge, pausing briefly on Naomi before landing on Daniel. Mr. Collins, the director said, her tone clipped. I was briefed on the situation. I assume this is the passenger in question? Yes, Miss Carter, Daniel said, his voice slightly strained. This is Miss Williams. Miss Carter turned to Naomi, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp, as if she were already assessing the situation. Miss Williams, I'm Sophia Carter, the regional director. I understand there's been an issue with our staff. I'd like to hear your perspective directly. Naomi stood, meeting Miss Carter's gaze without hesitation. Thank you for coming, Miss Carter. I'd be happy to explain what happened. But before we start, I want to make one thing clear. This isn't just about me. It's about the culture that allowed this to happen. For the first time, Miss Carter's neutral mask cracked, a flicker of unease crossing her features. She gestured toward a quieter corner of the lounge. Let's talk. Naomi followed, James by her side, as the storm that had been brewing now loomed larger, ready to break. The small conference nook of the lounge offered a deceptive sense of privacy, its frosted glass walls muffling the ambient noise but doing little to dull the tension that filled the air. Naomi and James seated themselves across from Sophia Carter, who carried herself with the kind of calm authority that suggested she'd navigated countless crises before. But Naomi could tell this was not a situation Miss Carter could easily finesse away. A clipboard and a sleek tablet sat on the table in front of the regional director, her tools of professionalism. She folded her hands neatly over them, her expression composed, though her sharp eyes revealed a keen awareness of the stakes. Daniel hovered awkwardly near the glass door, unsure if he was welcome in this private space. "Mr. Collins," Sophia said, her voice clipped but polite. "Please step outside. I'd like to speak with Miss Williams directly." Daniel hesitated, glancing at Naomi as if seeking permission, but her lack of acknowledgement made it clear he was irrelevant to her now. He slunk out, closing the door behind him, leaving Sophia, Naomi, and James alone in the charged silence. "Miss Williams," Sophia began, her tone deliberately neutral. "First, let me extend my sincerest apologies for the events that have transpired today. This is not the standard of service or respect our airline aims to uphold." Naomi met her gaze evenly, her expression unyielding. "Your apology is noted, Miss Carter, but words alone won't change the fact that I was publicly humiliated by your staff, denied access to services I was entitled to, and treated as if I didn't belong. This is bigger than an apology." Sophia nodded slowly, leaning back in her chair. "I understand your frustration, and I agree this requires more than a simple apology. I'd like to hear your account of the events in full, so we can ensure every detail is addressed." Naomi glanced at James, who gave a slight nod. She shifted her focus back to Sophia, her voice calm but resolute as she recounted every detail. She spoke of Linda's dismissive tone, Mike's blatant condescension, and the way the other passengers were allowed to use the charging station without issue. As she spoke, her words carried the weight of every indignity she'd endured, not just in this moment, but in a lifetime of being treated as less than. Sophia listened intently, her hands folded on the table, her face carefully neutral. But Naomi noticed the way her brows tightened ever so slightly, the subtle flicker of discomfort in her eyes as the story unfolded. "Do you have evidence to support these claims?" Sophia asked when Naomi had finished. James leaned forward, his presence calm but assertive. "We do," he said, sliding his phone across the table. The screen displayed a video captured by a nearby passenger, the audio clear enough to pick up Linda's and Mike's disparaging comments. Sophia watched in silence, her expression growing darker with each passing second. When the video ended, Sophia set the phone down and took a measured breath. "This behavior is inexcusable," she said, her voice colder now, the veneer of corporate detachment cracking. "I won't pretend this is anything less than what it is, blatant discrimination." Naomi folded her hands in her lap, her gaze steady. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Sophia straightened, her professionalism returning as she spoke. "First, Linda and Mike will be immediately removed from their positions. Their actions not only violated company policy, but also caused significant harm to you and to the reputation of our airline." Naomi didn't flinch, but she could feel James's approving glance at her side. "Second," Sophia continued, "we will be implementing a thorough review of our training programs and internal policies to ensure this kind of behavior is not tolerated in the future. Anti-discrimination training will become mandatory for all staff, and we will create stronger accountability measures to address incidents like this promptly." Sophia hesitated, her gaze softening just slightly. "And finally, Miss Williams, I'd like to personally extend an offer of compensation for your experience today. This includes a full refund for your flight, as well as complimentary first-class tickets for future travel." Naomi allowed the silence to stretch for a moment, her calm exterior masking the storm within. Compensation was expected, but it wasn't the resolution she had envisioned. "Your steps are noted, Miss Carter," Naomi said slowly. "But I want to make something clear. This isn't just about the two individuals you're removing. It's about the culture that allowed them to act this way without fear of consequence. It's about the passengers who watched and didn't intervene, the staff who saw and stayed silent. Sophia's eyes flickered with understanding, and Naomi leaned forward slightly, her voice gaining a sharp edge. This can't end with a refund and a training session. I want to see real change, not just for me, but for every person who walks into one of your terminals expecting dignity and respect. Sophia nodded, her expression serious. You have my word, Miss Williams. This will not be swept under the rug. If there are additional steps you believe we should take, I'm open to hearing them. Naomi exchanged a brief glance with James, who gave her a subtle nod. Then let's start with transparency, Naomi said. I want to see the results of your review, the changes you're implementing, and the outcomes of your training programs. And I want this conversation to be the foundation for a larger dialogue about how your airline can do better, not just for me, but for everyone. Sophia leaned back, her expression thoughtful. Agreed. I'll ensure you're updated every step of the way. Naomi sat back in her chair, a quiet strength radiating from her. She wasn't finished yet. This was only the beginning. But for now, the storm had found its first crack of light. Naomi stepped out of the glass-walled nook, her polished shoes tapping against the cold marble of the terminal floor. The tension in the lounge was palpable, the air heavy with unspoken words and wary glances. Linda and Mike stood off to the side, whispering furiously, their earlier bravado now reduced to panic. Passengers who had witnessed the unfolding drama leaned toward one another, their murmurs weaving a tapestry of speculation. Naomi took a slow, deliberate breath. Every move she made now felt weighted, observed, as though the entire lounge were waiting for her next act. But she wasn't performing. She was living her truth, unapologetically and with unwavering dignity. James followed a step behind her, his phone in hand as he typed out what she assumed were follow-up notes to ensure that Sophia Carter's promises would be honored. His presence, steady and unflinching, was a quiet reassurance, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. As Naomi approached the gate, a low commotion rippled through the crowd. Daniel, the manager, had returned, his expression fraught as he approached Linda and Mike. His voice was low but sharp, and though the words didn't carry far, the gestures and the growing tension in the air made their meaning unmistakable. Linda's face paled, her jaw slackening as she processed whatever Daniel had just said. Mike, by contrast, looked indignant, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He muttered something under his breath, his posture stiff with defiance, but Daniel's firm response left no room for argument. Then, as though summoned by the weight of their collective guilt, Sophia Carter emerged from the nook, her stride purposeful and her expression unreadable. The room seemed to hold its breath as she approached the gate counter, her polished heels clicking with a precision that demanded attention. She stopped just short of the trio, her gaze sharp as she addressed them. "This ends now," Sophia said, her voice low but laced with authority. The tension in her tone was like a storm about to break. Linda stammered, her eyes darting toward the crowd of passengers who were now openly staring. Miss Carter, please, this is all a misunderstanding. I didn't mean—" Sophia held up a hand, silencing her. "Enough. Your behavior today was inexcusable. You will both vacate your positions immediately." The words fell like thunderclaps, reverberating through the lounge. Linda's face crumpled, her feigned indignation dissolving into panic. "But I've worked here for years. I didn't—" "You knew exactly what you were doing," Sophia interrupted, her tone colder now. "You made a deliberate choice to treat a first-class passenger with disdain and disrespect, and you allowed your biases to guide your actions. That is not only unprofessional, it's unacceptable." Mike stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "This is ridiculous. She's blowing this out of proportion. We didn't—" "Enough!" Sophia's voice rose, commanding silence. The sheer authority in her tone froze everyone in place, including Mike, who now looked as though he wished he could disappear. "This airline has no place for individuals who undermine our values," Sophia continued, her gaze sweeping over the two of them. "Your actions don't just harm our passengers. They tarnish the reputation of every employee who works with integrity and professionalism. Effective immediately, you're both terminated. Linda let out a small gasp, her hands trembling as she fumbled for words. Mike muttered a curse under his breath, his face contorted with barely suppressed rage. But Sophia was unyielding, her gaze cutting through their defenses like a blade. As security arrived to escort them from the premises, Linda turned to Naomi, her eyes wide with desperation. "I didn't mean it. I swear I didn't mean it. Please." Naomi met her gaze, her expression unflinching. "You didn't mean to be caught," she said quietly, her words slicing through the air like a scalpel. "There's a difference." Linda recoiled as though struck, her lips trembling as tears welled in her eyes. But Naomi felt no pity. She had seen this pattern before, the feigned remorse, the desperate attempts to avoid consequences, and she was done letting it slide. As Linda and Mike were escorted away, the lounge erupted into hushed murmurs, passengers exchanging glances and whispers as the reality of what had just occurred sank in. Sophia turned back to Naomi, her expression softened but still serious. "I know this doesn't erase what happened," Sophia said, her voice quieter now. "But I hope it shows our commitment to making things right." Naomi inclined her head slightly, her composure intact. "It's a start," she said. "But making things right means ensuring this doesn't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone." Sophia nodded, a flicker of respect crossing her features. "You have my word. This will be a turning point for our organization." James stepped forward, his phone now tucked away as he addressed Sophia. "We'll hold you to that, and we'll be in touch to discuss next steps." Sophia nodded again before stepping back, leaving Naomi and James to reclaim the space they had fought so hard for. The lounge felt quieter now, the weight of the moment settling over everyone present. Naomi returned to her seat near the charging station, her phone now fully powered. As she unplugged it and slipped it back into her bag, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The battle wasn't over, it never truly was. But for now, justice had prevailed, and the first cracks in a broken system had been forced open. She leaned back, her gaze steady as she watched the world move on around her. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. The lounge had settled into an uneasy calm after Linda and Mike were escorted out, but the undercurrent of tension lingered. Naomi remained seated by the charging station, her posture composed, yet every muscle in her body felt taut, as if the air around her still carried the static of the storm that had just passed. She could feel the stares from the other passengers, some filled with admiration, others with discomfort, and a few with the same dismissive judgment she had confronted earlier. James sat across from her, his expression unreadable as he reviewed notes on his tablet. His presence, as always, was steady and deliberate. But Naomi could sense the unspoken approval in the way he occasionally glanced up at her. He didn't need to say it aloud. They both understood the significance of what had just transpired. The faint ding of an intercom announcement broke the silence, but the words blurred into background noise. Naomi's mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the day. She thought of Linda's trembling hands, her desperate pleas for forgiveness as she was led away. For a brief moment, Naomi felt the sting of empathy, not for the woman Linda had been today, but for the woman she might have been had she chosen differently. "I hope they learned something from this," Naomi said softly, her voice breaking the silence between her and James. James looked up, his dark eyes thoughtful. "You're more generous than most would be in your position," he said. "But I wouldn't hold your breath. People like Linda and Mike don't change overnight. Consequences might make them rethink their actions, but real growth, that takes time and a willingness to face their own biases." Naomi nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the glass walls of the lounge. "I just don't want this to feel empty, like it was just a spectacle." James leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. "It wasn't empty, Naomi. Not to the people who saw it, who felt seen because of what you did. You stood your ground. You demanded respect. That matters, even if you don't see the ripples right away." His words carried weight, but they didn't fully settle the unease in Naomi's chest. She had fought battles like this before, smaller skirmishes in boardrooms, subtle microaggressions in social settings, and every time she was reminded of how deeply the roots of discrimination ran. Today had been a victory, but the road ahead still felt endless. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, Miss Williams?" Naomi turned to see a young black woman standing a few feet away, clutching a small carry-on bag. Her face was nervous but hopeful, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Naomi straightened, offering a kind smile. "Yes?" Naomi said, her tone inviting. The woman hesitated, then stepped closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "I just wanted to say thank you for what you did back there. I saw everything and, well, it meant a lot, more than you know." Naomi's heart softened, the weight in her chest easing slightly. "Thank you," she said gently. "I'm glad it meant something to you." The woman nodded, her grip on her bag tightening. "It's just, I've dealt with things like that before. Not exactly the same, but you know what I mean. Seeing you stand up to them the way you did, it gave me hope." Naomi reached out, lightly touching the woman's arm. "Never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong," she said. "You have every right to take up space, to demand respect. Don't ever let them take that from you." The woman's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she nodded. "I won't, thank you." She glanced at James, giving him a small smile before walking away. Naomi watched her go, her words lingering in the air like a quiet hymn. She felt James's gaze on her and turned to see him watching her with a faint smile, one corner of his mouth quirking upward. "What?" she asked, a touch of humor in her voice. "Nothing," he said, leaning back in his chair. It's moments like that, Naomi. That's why this matters. That's why you matter." She rolled her eyes slightly, though she couldn't hide the small smile that tugged at her lips. "You're insufferable, you know that." "I prefer insightful," he replied smoothly, earning a quiet laugh from her. The laughter faded into a comfortable silence, and Naomi allowed herself a moment to breathe, to reflect. The battle wasn't over. Not just for her, but for every person who had ever felt the sting of being judged, dismissed, or made to feel invisible. But for the first time in a long while, she felt the stirrings of hope, fragile but steady, like a candle flickering in the dark. Her phone buzzed softly, drawing her attention. A notification from her calendar reminded her of the meeting she was traveling to attend. She glanced at the time and realized she'd need to board soon. Standing, she adjusted the strap of her bag and looked at James. "Ready?" she asked. "Always," he said, rising to his feet. As they walked toward the gate, Naomi held her head high, her steps purposeful. The world wasn't perfect, far from it, but she would continue to fight, to carve out spaces where justice and dignity prevailed, because that's who she was, a storm, quiet but unyielding, ready to shatter the silence wherever it tried to take hold. The terminal seemed brighter as Naomi and James walked toward the gate. The air was still thick with the echoes of what had transpired, but now it carried a sense of purpose rather than tension. The passengers who had watched the confrontation unfold stepped aside as Naomi passed, their murmurs quieter but tinged with respect. Some nodded discreetly, acknowledging her, while others quickly looked away, their discomfort still lingering. The gate agent, a young man who looked slightly nervous, straightened as Naomi approached. His gaze flicked to James, then back to her, before he forced a polite smile. "Miss Williams," he said, his tone careful but respectful, "your boarding process has been expedited. Please let me know if there's anything else you need." Naomi didn't reply immediately. Instead, she studied him for a moment, noting the faint sheen of sweat on his brow and the tightness in his posture. He wasn't like Linda or Mike. He wasn't dripping with prejudice or arrogance. He was afraid of making the wrong move, of being the next person called out. She let her gaze soften slightly, offering him a nod. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice calm but firm. The young man seemed to relax just a fraction, gesturing toward the priority lane with a flourish. Naomi and James stepped forward, and as they reached the entrance, James turned to her with a wry smile. "Expedited service," he murmured. "Looks like they're learning." Naomi allowed herself a small smile but didn't reply. Her focus was ahead, on the jet bridge that led to her next destination. Every step felt like a declaration, a quiet reminder that she belonged here, not just in first class, but in every space she chose to occupy. As they boarded the plane, the flight crew greeted her with warm smiles and an extra touch of deference. "Welcome aboard, Miss Williams," one attendant said, her voice almost reverent. "If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask." Naomi nodded politely, making her way to her seat. The first-class cabin was spacious and serene, a far cry from the chaos of the lounge. She settled into the plush leather seat, adjusting her bag beneath the window. James took the seat across the aisle, already pulling out his tablet to continue his notes. As the plane began boarding, Naomi allowed herself a moment to reflect. The events of the day played out in her mind, not as a series of isolated incidents, but as a larger narrative, a story of resilience, of justice, of the power in standing firm against the forces that sought to diminish her. The young black woman from the lounge came to mind, her voice trembling with gratitude as she thanked Naomi for her courage. That moment, more than any other, stayed with her. It was a reminder that her actions mattered, not just to her, but to the countless others who saw a piece of themselves in her struggle. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the final boarding call. Naomi glanced out the window, watching as the ground crew prepared for departure. The sun was setting, casting the tarmac in hues of gold and orange, and for a moment, the beauty of the scene quieted her thoughts. James leaned across the aisle, his voice low but steady. "You did good today, Naomi." She turned to him, her lips curving into a small, genuine smile. "We did good." He nodded, leaning back into his seat as the plane's engines roared to life. The cabin lights dimmed, and Naomi closed her eyes briefly, letting the hum of the plane wash over her. She wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't the end of the fight. There would be more battles, more moments of frustration and hurt. But today she had won a small victory, and that was enough for now. As the plane lifted into the air, Naomi opened her eyes and gazed out at the horizon, the endless expanse of sky stretching before her. The world was vast, full of challenges yet to be faced, but she would face them one by one, with the same unyielding resolve that had carried her through today. Because that's who she was, a force of nature, quiet yet unstoppable, carving a path through the storm and emerging stronger on the other side. And for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. And so this wasn't just a victory for one woman, it was a statement for anyone who has ever been dismissed, underestimated, or treated unfairly. Naomi's courage reminds us that standing up for what's right can lead to meaningful change, even in the most unexpected places. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss another powerful story that challenges injustice and celebrates resilience. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.